So, as I've noted, the first two editions of Leaves of Grass, 1855 and 1856, show the Whitmanian I, the Whitmanian self, as a power that can transcend identity and merge with difference. Put more concretely, we see Whitman, especially in Song of Myself, imagine that his I can move anywhere and can merge with anything, anyone. All the elements in his vast catalogs, his I can merge with. Uh, there's a sense that his identity is utterly universal because it can connect with anything particular. We see this also in Crossing Brooklyn Ferry, where the poet is less interested in merging with people in the present moment and more concerned with his ability to merge with people in the past and the future. Strangely enough, Garcia Lorca, 20th century poet, claimed that Whitman was the first totalitarian poet. An odd thing to say until we think about the I of these first two editions. And of course, I've mentioned Song of Myself, I've mentioned Crossing Brooklyn Ferry. I could also mention The Sleepers, where we see the poet's eye move through the dreams and the thoughts of all these people sleeping during the nighttime. When we start thinking about his I as totalizing, the idea that his I can distribute itself throughout the total, there's the way in which his I can master any situation by being able to become one via imagination with that situation. And not just the idea of the I being able to merge with people, but also the I being able to merge with processes, such as the relationship between life and death, the relationship between the collective and the individuals. In other words, the Whitmanian I of the first two books is confident, exuberant, one might say cocky, haughty, seemingly limitless in its ability to be whatever it wants. Well, as we noted, in the third edition of Leaves of Grass, 1860, we see poems such as Out of the Cradle Endlessly Rocking and As I Ebb with the Ocean of Life, which show a different kind of I, where we see the Whitmanian I questioning, full of doubt, hesitation, a feeling that his I is not being taken seriously by his readership, perhaps, a feeling that all those great conclusions of the first two editions aren't necessarily true, perhaps. And some believe that these two poems reflect a crisis in Whitman's emotional life. Well, the Civil War breaks out, and even though Whitman wrote probably most of his greatest poems before the Civil War, Whitman himself saw the Civil War as the defining event in his poetic life. First of all, Whitman was a staunch supporter of the Union. He did not believe in states' rights. He was also very much against slavery, and for this reason was opposed to most the southern states, the slaveholding states. And so he saw the Civil War as an opportunity for the Union to be reasserted again strongly. He thought that the Union would win the war, and when it did win the war, Union would be prevalent in the United States of America. But this political commitment of Whitman's, it pales in comparison to his personal commitment to the wounded of the Civil War. So Whitman, in December of 1862, saw in the New York Tribune, living in New York as he was, a list of wounded from one of the battles in the Civil War down near Washington, D.C., and he saw the name of Whitmore, and he thought, oh my gosh, that's a misprint. That must be my brother George Whitman. So he makes his way down to D.C. from New York. Along the way, he gets his pocket picked and has to go without food for 3 days. And when he first gets to the hospital where he thinks George will be, he sees a wagon load full of amputated arms and legs and hands and feet, and immediately gets a sense of the horror of this war, the brutality of this war. Well, luckily, George had a very minor wound in his cheek. But Whitman responded to the wounded soldiers. In this particular hospital, there were Union soldiers and Confederate soldiers. And he realized that he could sit with these soldiers, wounded soldiers. He could comfort them. He could talk to them. He could write letters for them back home. He could bring them candy. He could bring them little presents. In other words, he could be a kind of emotional nurse, if you will. So this is a new I, a new subjectivity that emerges for Whitman. Not the kind of totalizing I of the first two books, but the I as a nurse and a healer who finds power not in assertion, but who finds power in helping. So out of Whitman's experience of this hospital, he moved to Washington, and he got a low-grade job in the Army Paymaster office, and he would work however many hours a day, and then he would go spend time in the hospital, walking around, attending to the wounded, and becoming extremely close friends with some of these soldiers, and entering into a kind of asexually erotic relationship with them, treating them with hugs and kisses, a kind of wartime camaraderie that really spoke to his sense of himself as a poet of adhesiveness, someone who understands the intimacy of relationships between men. Another part of this I that we see during the Civil War, the I as, again, a nurse, as a healer. We also see Whitman in his collection of poems, Drum Taps, which grows out of his experience of the Civil War. We see an I in these drum tap poems, an I who writes not grand sweeping catalogs trying to encompass the whole world, but we see poems that are focused on very particular battlefield scenes, where we see soldiers connecting to other soldiers. We see soldiers mourning the death of other soldiers. We see soldiers getting wounded. It's as if Whitman becomes almost a painterly poet. And again, we see these very specific scenes. And the speakers in these scenes are rarely Walt Whitman. Walt Whitman did